So how do we study evolution? And that has to be the topic of this last recording, dealing with evolution. And we're going to break down kind of the basic ways to kind of approach learning more about evolution. And those are going to be the fossil record, studying structures of extinct species and looking for transition forms as species evolves, looking at biogeography, um, how we impose our understanding of geology and Earth history on evolution, because remember, evolution is happening over geologic time frames, right? So this is happening in a time frame that the continents are moving notably and separating populations, which we don't see every day. And then we can look at comparative anatomy, how body structure is different between different species. Talk about comparative embryology, how things develop, and then molecular biology, literally looking at the differences in DNA between species. So again, the first kind of technique we use to study evolution is looking at the fossil record. So if we can look at the remains of living things, we can actually get a feel for how old those fossils are as well. We can know what things look like when, right? And so this goes back to this idea that the deeper you go in sedimentary rock, the older that rock is. And you can see how, in this case, you see layers of sediment depositing over time, flowing down from the rivers, and organisms that are trapped and have to be made into fossils at those times are going to be, the older they are, the deeper they're going to be. And so we can date that and look at how things change, or where species kind of appear in the fossil record over time, or disappear in the fossil record for that matter. And that again goes back to this idea of geologic time. So a mere 225 million years ago, Pangea was in existence. And so this is the Permian era, and Pangea was a supercontinent. The Earth was very different back then, much warmer. Was one giant landmass. So 225 million years ago, I mean, plants started coming onto land 500 million years ago. So we've got a lot going on. This is not that long ago, considering the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. So as you can see, as you move 200 million years ago, 135 million years ago, only there do you start to see the current continents starting to kind of come together, right? And so what you could see then, when you kind of apply this biogeographic lens to evolution, the east coast of South America was once an integral part of the west coast of Africa. And when you see species that are very similar but now have evolved differently from that common ancestor that may have been a population when the continents were not separate from each other. And so you have to add this layer of understanding when you study evolution. So again, remember, geologic time is more than your brain can handle, but we can do the math and look at how species appear and disappear over millions of years, and more specifically, as we get into comparative anatomy, how we find transition species. So we can look at fossils and piece together anatomy and say, oh, well, this one has many similar characteristics to this, except for these attributes. And then we find the little changes as we go and find a better and more complete fossil record, right? So comparative anatomy says that, we're going to select for those individuals that are most suited to their environment. And that may mean that those with shorter limbs that ultimately became fins were good at the time. And then they moved deeper into the water and selected for those babies that had variation, that had more fin-like limbs, and so on and so forth, until we have the recent ancestor of the current modern-day whale, right? So here you had an organism that went, a history of land animals that came onto land from the sea, and then these are organisms that have returned to the sea. But you can see within their anatomy the remnants of once being on land. Now, if we look and continue that study of comparative anatomy, even among extant organisms, so just not looking at fossils anymore, but looking at the anatomy of current species, we can see another degree of homology, right? So the bones in the limb of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat all have very distinctive similarities. They have a basic structure that, though modified from a developmental point of view, is very similar. Now, this brings up a whole new definition, a much more accurate definition of the word homologous. So we've talked about homologous chromosomes. Oh, they have all the same genes. They're kind of the same, but not exactly. And that's a horrible definition. So I always look forward to this point in time where we can talk about a real definition of homology. And we can only use this definition now that we understand evolution. Because the definition of homologous means that you're derived from a shared evolutionary ancestor. So homologous means that you're derived from a shared evolutionary ancestor. So human limbs, cat limbs, whale fins, and bat wings are all similar to each other because all of these organisms have a common ancestor that had a progenitor limb from which differential environments selected for ultimately different structures. But the homology is there. You can see those bones. They're homologous. They share a common ancestor. So now we talk about alleles being homologous, right? Alleles have a common ancestor gene, right? The gene, so before there were any blue-eyed people on the planet, we all had brown eyes. And then there was a mutation in that ancestor gene that was now a branching point where then you had some people with blue eyes, right? So you have alleles, the blue-eyed gene and the brown-eyed gene are still the gene for eye color, but they're homologous, right? Because they have a shared common ancestor of that progenitor brown-eyed gene from thousands of years ago, right? So this then introduces the idea of homologous versus analogous structures. So these are all homologous limbs. They share a common ancestor, where analogous structures look the same but don't share a common ancestor. So like the wing of a bat or a bird compared to the wing of an insect, right? So that insect wing clearly anatomically is developmentally very different than the wing of a bat. Though they both serve the same function and are flat and wide and flap to give the organism the ability to fly, they are analogous structures. So what you talk about then is kind of divergent selection, right? Divergent evolution, where you have a common structure that now is changing within two different species or populations based on different environmental factors. Or you have what's called convergent evolution, where you have a convergence of a shape, like the shape of a wing, though you have started it from different evolutionary ancestors, right? So that's a really, really important concept, and we'll work on that as well. Now, you can also look at development. How do things actually develop? And the more similar their development is, the more closely related they probably are. So if you look at, we talk about comparative embryology, right? Because we all start as a zygote. And how that zygote then divides mitotically to build the organism are very, very old pathways, right? So fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, frog, cow, rabbit, human, all those very early stage embryos look very, very similar. You'd be hard-pressed to determine specifically which is which. Now, those that stay similar longer are probably more closely related. By the time you get to the second row, you can clearly tell the difference between a fish and a human or a rabbit, right? But be telling the difference between a cow, a rabbit, and a human, you're still not there yet. In the third stage, now you're starting to get to development. Like a pig is different, and the chicken's different, and the tortoise is different. But the longer you follow that same developmental path, that means the more similarly related are, because these pathways are very, very old, right? Because they have to be. If you screw up a developmental pathway in an embryological stage, usually you terminate the organ. It doesn't work anymore, right? It's a fatal mutation. Now, finally, this has only occurred recently in our study of evolution, is the fact that we know what DNA is, and we can sequence it, and we can use computers to compare that sequence. So we can say, hey, if evolution is genetic change in a population over time, how different is the DNA? Like, just go right to the source. And so this now, molecular analysis, is very, very powerful in developing phylogenetic trees. And the cool thing about it is we talk about genotype related to phenotype. Before we had molecular analysis, people had to rely on phenotype, right? You had to be like, well, how big are the leaves? What's the shape of the leaves? What's the type of flower? What does this organism look like? And what we found is that in many cases, the phenotypic phylogenetic trees that were developed over the last couple hundred years are very, very accurate when we look at the DNA sequence. Not always, but that just speaks to this idea, this linkage between the information in DNA makes the organism's phenotype, right? So that's our final kind of point of study. So with that, then, we want to review evolution, genetic change in a species or population over time. Natural selection, remember, is the mechanism of evolution to work with if those individuals best suited to their environment will reproduce the most, and hence their genes will move on. And so then finally, what I want you to do as an assignment, and it'll be on the website, is I want you to read chapter 28 from the book Born to Run. And it is a great example of one, talking about human evolution, but also a very good science. Science of observation, asking questions, and looking at how we can use anatomy to think about evolution. So read that, and we'll talk about it more.